Somewhere deep in the jungle of northern Guatemala, where the air hangs thick and green-smelling and the howler monkeys call out across the canopy at dusk, there is a stone city that was forgotten for centuries. Not lost to fire, a war, or flood, just swallowed. The trees grew up through the plazas. The roots cracked the staircases. The vines wrapped themselves around the faces of kings carved into limestone. And when explorers finally found it, they could barely see it, because the jungle had been there so long that the pyramids had become hills, indistinguishable from the landscape around them. This is Tikal. And at its peak, perhaps 80,000 people lived here. They had markets and palaces and schools. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus across decades. Their mathematicians invented zero. Their architects built temples that still stand, still precise, still pointing at the sky they once reached toward. And then, one by one, across 2 centuries, the great cities fell silent. Tonight, we are going to find out why. And more than that, we are going to understand who they were, not just in their silence, but in their extraordinary noise. This is the story of the Maya. Not a simple story. Not a short one. It spans more than 3,000 years of continuous human civilization, from the first farming villages taking root in the steamy lowlands around 2000 BCE, to the cities of the Classic period whose glory would rival anything in the ancient world, through the puzzling silence that descended over those cities in the 9th century, and all the way to the millions of Maya people alive today who carry this inheritance in their languages, their ceremonies, and their understanding of time itself. It is a story of extraordinary intellectual achievement and devastating human brutality, of divine kings who claimed to speak to the gods and of farmers who fed entire cities from reclaimed swampland, of a writing system so complex it took modern scholars decades to crack it, and of a calendar so precise it still astonishes astronomers. Before we go any further, if you have been watching this channel for a while, you know what we do here. We take history seriously, we tell it carefully, and we let it unfold slowly the way a good story should. If this is your first time joining us at the Drowsy Archivist, welcome. You can find more of these long-form historical narratives right here on the channel. And if tonight's journey through the jungles of Mesoamerica sounds like exactly the kind of thing you want more of, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. It helps more than you might think. Now, let us begin at the beginning. To understand where the Maya came from, you have to first sit with the landscape they were born into. Imagine the Yucatan Peninsula and the lowlands stretching south into what is now Guatemala and Belize. A vast, seasonally waterlogged world of limestone bedrock, tropical forest, and winding river systems. The ground here was not obviously generous. The soils in the lowlands were thin over rock, quick to flood in the rainy season and baked hard in the dry months. Rivers ran unpredictably. There were no obvious corridors of easy fertility, no broad river valleys like the Nile or the Tigris to announce that civilization should happen here. And yet it did happen here. Extraordinarily. Linguists who study the origins of the Maya language family tell us that something they call Proto-Mayan, the ancestral tongue from which all later Maya languages would descend, was being spoken somewhere in the western or northern Guatemalan highlands probably around 2500 BCE, possibly somewhat earlier. The evidence is in the reconstructed vocabulary of that proto-language, the kinds of words that can be reliably traced back to its earliest form. Words for maize, words for jade, words for certain animals native to the highland environment. These linguistic fingerprints suggest that the original Maya-speaking population was rooted in the highlands before spreading outward through migration and expansion into the lowlands that would become their most celebrated home. By around 2000 BCE, which is where most scholars mark the formal beginning of what is called the Preclassic period, the first great era of Maya development, the descendants of those early Proto-Maya speakers were already beginning the slow, profound transition from mobile hunter-gatherer groups to something more settled, more complex, and more deliberately organized around agriculture. This was not a single moment of transformation. It was a centuries-long process, and the bones tell the story honestly. Analysis of skeletal remains from early Maya sites shows that maize had indeed become a significant component of the diet by this period. It shows up in the chemical signature of the bones. But fish, game animals, and foraged foods were still making up a substantial part of what people ate. The world was not yet organized around agriculture, but it was moving that way. What made this transition possible, and ultimately what would underpin every subsequent achievement of Maya civilization, was the domestication and intensive cultivation of maize. Corn, as we call it today, was arguably the single most important crop in human history on the American continent, and the Maya relationship to it was not merely agricultural. It was theological. Their creation stories, preserved most completely in the extraordinary Kitsch Maya text known as the Popol Vuh, tell of the gods' attempts to create human beings. first from mud, which crumbled, then from wood, which failed, and finally, successfully, from maize dough. In the Maya worldview, human beings were quite literally made of corn. To grow corn was to participate in the act of creation itself. To eat corn was to be reminded of your own divine origins. In the lowlands, particularly in the area around what is now northern Belize and the Petén region of Guatemala, small farming communities began to put down roots in the centuries after 2000 BCE. The site of Cuello in Belize has yielded carbon-dated evidence of Maya occupation as far back as around 2600 BCE, making it one of the earliest definitively identified Maya settlements in the archaeological record. By around 1800 BCE, communities were establishing themselves in the Soconusco region along the Pacific coastal plain, already cultivating the staple crops that would define Maya civilization for millennia: maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. And around the same time, something significant appears in the archaeological record: pottery. The first ceramic vessels begin to show up at Maya sites dating to around 1800 BCE, and they are not simple objects. They represent permanence. You make pottery when you are staying in one place long enough for it to matter. The early Preclassic period, spanning roughly from 2000 to 1000 BCE, was not an age of pyramids or inscribed stone monuments or divine kings riding into battle. It was quieter than that and in some ways more consequential. It was the age of foundations. Small villages grew, their populations supported by increasingly sophisticated agricultural management. Evidence from these early sites shows the beginnings of social differentiation. Some households larger than others, some graves containing more goods than others, hinting at the earliest stirrings of the class distinctions that would eventually harden into the rigid hierarchies of the Classic period. Obsidian, the black volcanic glass used to make cutting tools, traveled long distances from its sources in highland Guatemala to these early lowland communities, telling us that even at this early stage, exchange networks were operating across considerable distances. Shells from the Pacific coast, jade from the Motagua River Valley. The raw materials of a trading economy were already in motion. The religious life of these earliest settled Maya communities revolved, as far as we can reconstruct it, around the rhythms of the natural world. Deities of rain, maize, and the sun dominated their emerging pantheon, forces that directly determined whether the harvest would sustain the village through the dry season. Fire was sacred, with evidence of ritual burning turning up at multiple early sites. Communal ceremonies that brought people together to honor these forces were probably already a feature of village life. And in those ceremonies, we see the earliest roots of the elaborate, bloody, magnificent religious culture that would eventually fill Tikal's great plaza with chanting crowds and the smoke of burning incense and the beat of drums that could be heard across the jungle canopy. By around 1200 BCE, the settlement of Nakbi in the Mirador basin of northern Guatemala, a name meaning the visible one, had grown to a scale that historians describe as a proto-city. Nakbi is important because it represents the earliest evidence we have of the Maya beginning to think architecturally on a monumental scale. Buildings were going up here that required organization, planning, labor management, and the direction of considerable community resources toward a shared purpose. Causeways, raised roads connecting different parts of the settlement, were being constructed. These are not the actions of a loosely organized village. These are the actions of a society with leadership, with hierarchy, and with the ability to mobilize collective effort toward large-scale goals. The seeds of everything that would come later were germinating right here in the Mirador Basin. It is worth pausing to appreciate how remarkable this early phase of Maya development truly was. When the Maya were laying the foundations of Nakbi around 1200 BCE, the city of Troy had already fallen. The great temples of Egypt's new kingdom were already ancient. The civilizations of the Mediterranean were in full flower. But in the jungles of Mesoamerica, human beings working without iron tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden, relying on human muscle, rope, and ingenious organizing principles, were beginning to construct one of the most remarkable cultures in the history of our species. They did it from the ground up, drawing on a landscape that offered both challenges and resources in approximately equal measure, and they shaped that landscape to their needs so thoroughly that 2,000 years of subsequent development would be built on what they established in these quiet centuries. The transition into the Middle Preclassic period, beginning around 1000 BCE, would accelerate all of these processes dramatically. Villages would grow into cities. Exchange networks would thicken into organized trade routes. Social hierarchies would crystallize into ruling lineages. And somewhere in those larger, denser, more complex communities, someone would begin scratching symbols onto pottery and stone that would eventually develop into the most sophisticated writing system ever created in the pre-Columbian Americas. But that story belongs to the next chapter of Maya history. It is worth spending one more moment with the physical reality of those early farming communities, because there is a tendency in broad historical narratives to skip over the quiet centuries and leap straight to the monuments. But the quiet centuries are where the essential human work happened. The development of effective maize cultivation in a tropical lowland environment was not a simple or automatic process. The soils of the Petén were not naturally rich. They were thin over limestone bedrock, quick to exhaust under intensive cultivation. The seasonal flooding that characterized the Bajos meant that planting had to be timed precisely and that fields had to be carefully chosen or carefully built up above the waterline. The dry season, which could last as long as 5 months, created annual water stress that required management if crops were to survive. What the early Maya developed in response to these challenges was an agricultural knowledge system of remarkable sophistication. They learned which varieties of maize performed best in which microenvironments. They learned when to plant relative to the patterns of the seasonal rains, and how to read the signs in the natural world that indicated when those rains were approaching. They developed techniques for building up the thin soils with organic material, for intercropping, planting maize, beans, and squash together in the traditional milpa system that remains in use in Maya communities to this day, in ways that maintain soil fertility and reduce the need for following. The 3 crops of the milpa worked together beautifully. The maize grew tall and provided a structure for the bean vines to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen from the air back into the soil, and the squash spread out low and wide, shading the ground to retain moisture and suppress weeds. Together, they provided a nutritional profile: carbohydrates from maize, protein from beans, vitamins and minerals from squash, that could sustain a healthy population through the year. The storage of food surpluses was another essential technology that the early Maya developed and refined. Ceramic vessels, those first pots that appear in the archaeological record around 1800 BCE, served not just for cooking but for the dry storage of shelled maize and other foods across the months when fields were not productive. Underground storage pits, known from later Maya contexts, may have been in use during this early period as well. The ability to store surpluses was the material foundation of everything that came after. Specialist populations who did not grow their own food, urban centers whose markets ran on the exchange of stored agricultural produce, states whose power rested on the ability to collect, store, and redistribute agricultural surpluses through tribute systems. Every classic Maya city, in a very direct sense, rested on the foundation of these early storage vessels. One of the most powerful indicators of the sophistication of early Maya social organization is the evidence for long-distance exchange of prestige goods. Obsidian, the black volcanic glass that fractures to an edge sharper than surgical steel, was the supreme cutting material of the pre-metallic Americas, and its geological sources are specific and mappable. The obsidian found in early Preclassic Maya sites in the lowlands came from highland Guatemala, hundreds of kilometers away from where it was used. How did it get there? Not through chance. Through deliberate, organized exchange. Probably through a combination of direct trading expeditions and multi-step exchange networks in which goods moved from hand to hand across the landscape, each transaction adding value and extending the reach of the material. The jade that would become the most symbolically important material in the classic Maya world, associated with royalty, with the maize god, with life itself, also traveled from its highland Guatemalan sources into the lowlands at this early date. Marine shells from the Pacific coast appeared inland. The world of the early Maya, even in its humblest villages, was connected to a wider world through the circulation of these materials. This connectedness was not merely economic. The movement of prestige goods was embedded in social relationships, obligations of reciprocity, alliance building, the reinforcement of ties between communities through the giving and receiving of valued objects. The leaders of early Maya communities who controlled access to obsidian sources, who had the relationships that brought jade or shells or exotic bird feathers into their village, were the ancestors of the classic Maya noble class. Status was built on networks of exchange, and those networks were already taking shape in the quiet centuries before the first pyramid rose from the jungle floor. The middle Preclassic period, running roughly from 1000 to 400 BCE, is where Maya civilization begins to look unmistakably like itself. The changes that unfold across these 6 centuries are not merely quantitative, not simply more people, bigger buildings, longer trade routes. They are qualitative. They represent a shift in the organizing principles of society itself, a deepening of the cultural, political, and cosmological frameworks that would define the Maya for the next 2,000 years. Across the Maya lowlands during this period, the pattern of settlement changes noticeably. Communities that had been scattered hamlets and small villages begin to coalesce around central places. Nakbi, already identified as a proto-city in the earlier period, grows substantially. In the northern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, settlement spreads widely. In northern Belize, sites like Cuello, Cerros, Nomel, and Lemani show major building activity. The Maya lowlands were filling up, and as populations grew, so did the competition for land, resources, and the social distinctions that came with controlling access to them. The archaeological evidence from this period reflects an increasingly stratified society, and increasingly stratified societies need ideological infrastructure to justify their hierarchies. That need would be answered by the development of divine kingship, elaborate religious architecture, and writing. The most spectacular development of the late Preclassic period, spanning from about 400 BCE to 100 CE, was the rise of El Mirador. And spectacular is not too strong a word. El Mirador was a city of almost incomprehensible scale for its time. Located in the northern Petén region of Guatemala, in a low-lying basin that was actually composed largely of swampland that had been drained and manipulated to support agriculture, El Mirador at its peak covered approximately 16 square kilometers, an area larger than many modern city centers. It rose to prominence by around 500 BCE and reached its full glory over the following 3 centuries, becoming what archaeologists now describe as one of the first true capital cities of Maya civilization. What El Mirador built is still astonishing. The site contains some of the largest pyramidal structures ever constructed anywhere in the ancient Maya world. The La Danta complex at El Mirador has a total volume estimated at around 2.8 million cubic meters, making it one of the largest pyramids by total volume ever built anywhere in the world. Think about that. Before the birth of Julius Caesar, before the construction of the Colosseum, before the first century of the Common Era, Maya builders in the jungle of Guatemala were piling up more stone and earth than almost any structure human civilization had yet attempted. And they were doing it without iron tools, without wheels, without draft animals, purely with human labor organized and directed by a leadership structure sophisticated enough to mobilize, feed, and coordinate thousands of workers over generations. The architectural signature of late Preclassic Maya construction is the triadic pyramid, a distinctive 3-temple arrangement in which a dominant central structure is flanked by 2 smaller inward-facing buildings, all elevated on a shared basal platform. This form appears at El Mirador in extraordinary numbers. The site may contain as many as 36 triadic structures, and it is found at dozens of other Preclassic sites as well, from Nakbi right next door to Cerros and Belize to the distant site of Zabilchaltén in northern Yucatan. The widespread adoption of this specific architectural form across hundreds of kilometers of Maya territory is a powerful indicator of shared cosmological beliefs being expressed in stone. The triadic form appears to be deeply connected to Maya mythology, likely a 3-dimensional expression of a specific sacred geography that would continue to resonate through Maya religious architecture into the Classic period and beyond. El Mirador was not just enormous, it was connected. The city had an extensive network of causeways, raised, paved roads that linked different parts of the city and extended outward to connect El Mirador with neighboring centers. These causeways served practical functions in a landscape that flooded seasonally and would have been difficult to traverse on foot during the rainy months. But they also served symbolic ones. Roads in the ancient world were statements of power and reach, physical demonstrations of a state's ability to organize labor and project authority across space. El Mirador's causeways declared, with limestone and packed earth, that this city was the center of a web of relationships that extended far beyond its own boundaries. Supporting this urban center was what must have been a remarkably sophisticated agricultural system. The Mirador Basin contains large areas of seasonal swamp known as bajos, and evidence suggests that the Maya had been actively managing and draining these wetlands to create productive agricultural land. Raised field agriculture, building up platforms of soil above the waterline and cultivating them intensively, would have been capable of producing substantial food surpluses to feed a large non-agricultural population of builders, scribes, priests, and administrators. The swamps that had originally attracted settlers to the basin because of their water resources had been transformed into the agricultural engine of a major civilization. By the late Preclassic, the Maya were also raising stele, carved stone monuments, essentially tall stone slabs with images and inscriptions carved into their faces. These monuments served multiple purposes. They commemorated important events. They celebrated and legitimized rulers. They recorded dates in the emerging calendar system. And by around 400 BCE, early versions of what would become the long count calendar, the Mayan system for recording absolute dates on a scale of thousands of years, were already appearing. The earliest known Maya stela with a long count date was not at El Mirador itself but at sites in the broader network connected to it. By the 3rd century BCE, a developed hieroglyphic script was already in use in the Peton region. The writing system, one of the great intellectual achievements in human history, was not invented in the Classic period. It was already functioning in the Preclassic. In the highlands of Guatemala, another great Preclassic center was taking shape simultaneously. Quemanaljuyu, located beneath what is now Guatemala City, which means that most of it has been destroyed by modern construction, was the largest highland capital of the late Preclassic period and a major hub of long-distance trade. Quemanaljuyu sat at a crossroads of critical trade routes: jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, cacao from the coastal lowlands. The city's rulers controlled the flow of these prestige goods across the Maya world and beyond, linking the Pacific coastal trade with routes running north into the lowlands and west toward the Gulf Coast. Beautiful carved stone monuments from Quemanaljuyu, some bearing hieroglyphic texts, show a refined artistic tradition that was developing in parallel with the lowland Preclassic culture, sharing enough features to suggest intensive communication and exchange while remaining distinctively its own. And then, around 100 to 250 CE, something happened that archaeologists call the Preclassic collapse. And it is worth noting before we encounter the more famous classic collapse later in this story, that there were actually 2 major periods of widespread urban decline in Maya history, not one. El Mirador was abandoned. Quemanaljuyu shrank dramatically. Other major Preclassic centers were depopulated. The reasons remain poorly understood and are actively debated among scholars. Some point to environmental factors: drought, soil exhaustion, changes in the water table. Others suggest political fragmentation, internal conflict, the failure of the governing systems that had held these early polities together. The lack of clear epigraphic records from this transitional period makes it difficult to reconstruct with confidence. What we do know is that this first collapse was not the end of Maya civilization. It was a reorganization. The population dispersed. Settlements shifted. New centers began to emerge elsewhere. Among them, a site in the Peton that had been occupied since around 350 BCE but that had not yet achieved its full potential. That site was Tikal. And the world it was about to build would surpass even the glories of El Mirador. The Classic period of Maya civilization, running from approximately 250 CE to around 900 CE, is where the story that most people know begins. This is the world of the great stone cities, the soaring pyramids, the elaborately carved stelae recording the genealogies and conquests of divine kings, the ball courts and the hieroglyphic stairways and the painted tombs. This is the period that explorers stumbled upon in the 19th century and could barely believe. And it is, in many ways, the period that most thoroughly justifies the word civilization, in the richest and most demanding sense of that term. The Classic period is defined archaeologically largely by a specific cultural practice: the erection of carved stone monuments bearing long count calendar dates. Beginning around 250 CE, Maya rulers across the lowlands began systematically commemorating important events with inscribed stone stelae, altars, and architectural elements bearing precise dates in the long count calendar. This practice spread across the Maya lowlands over the following decades and centuries, creating what is now, for scholars who can read the glyphs, an invaluable historical record of dynastic successions, military victories, ritual performances, and astronomical events spanning centuries. The Maya were, among other things, obsessive recorders of time and of themselves. At its peak, Classic Maya civilization covered an area roughly twice the size of medieval England, and was considerably more densely populated. The civilization included more than 40 cities, each of them effectively an independent city-state with its own ruling dynasty, its own patron deities, its own artistic traditions, and its own political alliances and rivalries. The largest of these cities held populations of somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 people, numbers that are still debated and that have consistently been revised upward as new archaeological evidence accumulates. And around each major urban center, stretching outward through the forest, lay a dense rural population of farmers, artisans, and specialists of every kind, a hinterland population that in some cases may have been even larger than the urban core. Estimates for the total peak population of the Classic Maya vary enormously, but credible scholars have suggested figures ranging from 2 million to as many as 10 million people. The city of Tikal stands in many ways as the emblematic achievement of Classic Maya urbanism. Located deep in the Peton rainforest of what is now Guatemala, Tikal, known to its own inhabitants as Mutal, was probably the most powerful city in the Maya lowlands during the early Classic period and again in the late Classic. Its history stretches back to around 350 BC, but it was during the Classic period that it built the structures that still define the site today. Temple 1, known as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises approximately 45 meters above the Great Plaza, its steep limestone sides climbing in 9 terraced levels, a number that echoed the 9 levels of the Maya underworld Xibalba, to a roof cone that once bore painted decorations visible from kilometers away. Temple 2, facing it across the Great Plaza, matches it in height and drama. Together they frame a public space that could have accommodated thousands of people for ceremonies, royal displays, sacrifices, and the communal theatrical experiences through which ancient states maintained their legitimacy and their social cohesion. Tikal's history was not one of uninterrupted dominance. In 378 CE, the city experienced what archaeologists describe as a significant political intervention from the great highland metropolis of Teotihuacan, located in what is now central Mexico, a site that during the early Classic period exerted extraordinary cultural and possibly political influence across Mesoamerica. A figure connected to Teotihuacan arrived at Tikal, and shortly thereafter a new ruler with strong Teotihuacan connections took power, inaugurating a dynasty that would shape Tikal's political culture for generations. Tikal's primary rival during the late Classic period was the city of Calakmul, located in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche, just north of the Guatemalan border. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul was the defining geopolitical contest of the Maya Classic world. Two superpowers, each building alliances, proxy relationships, and satellite city-states across the lowlands, each capable of inflicting devastating defeat on the other. In 562 CE, Calakmul Maya forces defeated Tikal so thoroughly that the city entered what archaeologists call the Tikal hiatus, a period of about 130 years during which Tikal erected no new dated monuments and appears to have been politically suppressed. It was not until the great ruler Xichén Itzá came to power in 682 CE that Tikal fully reasserted itself, defeating Calakmul in 695 CE and inaugurating a new period of monument construction that produced the great paired pyramids we see at the site today. When Xichén Itzá died around 734 CE, he was buried inside Temple 1, his bones adorned with jade, the most precious substance in the Maya world. Palenque, in what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, is a different kind of classic Maya city, smaller than Tikal, but in some ways more refined, more intricately beautiful, the site that has perhaps most powerfully captured the modern imagination. It sits against the base of a forested escarpment, with small rivers running through it and dense jungle on 3 sides, and the architecture that has survived here is of remarkable elegance and sophistication. The corbelled arches, a false arch created by progressively overlapping stone courses, used throughout Palenque's buildings, achieve a grace that few Maya sites can match. And beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions, in a crypt that was not discovered until 1952, lies the tomb of Chichén Itzá, known to history simply as Pakal the Great, who ruled Palenque for 68 years from 615 to 683 CE, and who transformed it from a second-tier city into a major classic Maya power. Pakal's sarcophagus lid is one of the most celebrated objects in all of pre-Columbian art. The stone carving shows the king falling backward along the axis of the world tree, the cosmic Saba tree that connected the Maya underworld to the earth and the heavens, at the moment of his death, symbolizing his passage into the afterlife and his eventual rebirth as the maize god. The carving is so elaborate, the iconography so densely layered, the execution so technically demanding, that it required the work of master sculptors working under royal patronage to produce. For decades after its discovery, a famous misinterpretation suggested that Pakal was actually depicted operating some kind of spacecraft, the so-called Palenque astronaut theory that formed one of the founding myths of the ancient astronauts movement. The actual scholarly reading of the iconography, extensively documented and cross-referenced with dozens of other classic Maya examples of the same symbolic language, leaves no ambiguity. This is a Maya king on the world tree, following a path that every classic Maya ruler and every person who died would eventually walk. But we will return to the ancient astronaut question later. The city of Copán, located in the Copán Valley of what is now western Honduras, occupied a different ecological niche from Tikal and Palenque, a narrow mountain valley rather than the broad lowland plain, and its achievements were correspondingly distinctive. Copán is renowned above all for its sculptural program, particularly its series of elaborately carved stelae and its extraordinary hieroglyphic stairway, the longest pre-Columbian inscription in the Americas, containing some 2,000 individual glyphs recording the dynastic history of Copán's ruling lineage across centuries. The dynasty traced its origins to the founder Yax Cucamo, great son Green Quetzalmacaw, who established his rule around 426 CE. Copán's great period of artistic and architectural achievement came during the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, producing carved figures and portraits of such naturalistic power that they have sometimes been described as having a quality closer to portraiture than to the more conventionalized carved imagery found at many other Maya sites. The trade networks that connected these classic Maya cities to one another and to the wider Mesoamerican world were extraordinary in their reach and complexity. Jade moved from the Motagua Valley across the entire Maya world and beyond. Obsidian from highland Guatemala and from the Yuxtepic source reached cities throughout the lowlands. Cacao, the source of both a prestige drink and a kind of currency, moved through networks that extended from the Pacific lowlands into the highland and lowland centers. Salt, produced in coastal Yucatan, traveled south along established routes. Cotton textiles, decorated ceramics, rare bird feathers, marine shells. The material culture of classic Maya cities was sustained by a commerce that stretched hundreds of kilometers in every direction, binding city-states that were politically independent into an economic community of enormous scale and sophistication. Classic Maya art produced during these 6 centuries of peak development stands as one of the great artistic achievements in pre-Columbian history, or without qualification in world history. The painted murals at Bonampak, discovered in 1946 in excellent preservation in the jungle of Chiapas, show warfare, sacrifice, music, and ceremony in colors that remained vivid after more than 12 centuries. Brilliant blue, orange, white, and yellow figures filling the walls of 3 rooms with complex multi-figure compositions of a sophistication and narrative density that surprised scholars who had previously imagined classic Maya art to be primarily religious and formal. The murals at Bonampak show defeat and humiliation, the captive ruler presented before the victorious king, the torture of prisoners, the dance of victory, historical events painted with the emotional directness and human specificity of something genuinely witnessed. The polychrome ceramics of the classic period, the Princeton vase, the Fenton vase, and dozens of other exceptional vessels from the 7th and 8th centuries show mythological narratives with the same visual sophistication. The hero twins in the underworld, royal ancestors receiving homage, supernatural beings engaged in cosmological dramas. These are not merely decorative objects. They are painted books in ceramic form, texts written in a visual language that scholars have spent decades learning to read. This was a world at the height of its power. These were people who had taken a challenging tropical landscape and built something of overwhelming ambition in it. And yet, somewhere in the middle of this golden age, the forces that would eventually unravel it were already at work. To understand the Maya civilization beyond its pyramids and its inscribed stone monuments, to understand the human reality of these cities, you have to descend from the great temple summits and walk into the plazas and the neighborhoods and the market stalls and the agricultural fields that surrounded them. Because classic Maya civilization was not just an elite phenomenon. It was a living, breathing society of extraordinary complexity, encompassing millions of people in wildly different social positions, united by shared cultural frameworks and divided by sharp hierarchical distinctions. At the very summit of classic Maya society sat the Keohulajah, the Holy Lord, or Divine King. This was not simply a political title. It was a theological claim. The Keohulajah was understood to be a living God, a being who stood at the intersection of the human and divine realms, capable of communicating with supernatural forces, of performing the rituals that maintain cosmic order, of conjuring the spirits of ancestors and deities through acts of bloodletting. The Divine King was, in the Maya worldview, a necessary cosmological functionary. Without him, the sun might not rise, the rains might not come, the maize might not grow. His personal body was a site of cosmic significance. The blood he drew from his own tongue or his own penis during ritual self-sacrifice was not merely symbolic. It was, in Maya belief, a form of fuel that sustained the universe. The political power of these divine kings was expressed in the most visceral and tangible ways. They commissioned the construction of the great pyramid temples that dominated the skylines of classic Maya cities. They directed warfare against neighboring states, not necessarily for territorial expansion so much as for the capture of high-status prisoners who could then be displayed publicly and eventually sacrificed in ceremonies that demonstrated the king's power and maintained his relationship with the gods. They were the ultimate arbiters of trade, of tribute collection, of resource distribution. Their genealogies were carved into stone and proclaimed in publicly accessible hieroglyphic texts precisely because genealogical legitimacy was the foundation of their claim to divine status. To have the right ancestors was to have the right to rule. Below the divine king in the social hierarchy were the nobles, called the Jah more generically, who served as administrators, military commanders, long-distance merchants, and the stewards of the king's estate. Noble families competed fiercely for positions close to the king and for the privileges and resources those positions brought. They built their own sub-palaces in the neighborhoods surrounding the royal core of the city. Their tombs, while not as grand as the royal sepulchres, were furnished with painted ceramics, jade ornaments, obsidian tools, and other goods that traveled long distances to reach them. Literacy was concentrated heavily among the noble class. The ability to read and write hieroglyphs was both a practical skill and a marker of elite status. Among the nobles, scribes occupied a special and fascinating position. Hieroglyphic inscriptions at multiple classic Maya sites specifically identify figures as scribes, and the scribe's role was religiously significant. They were not merely bureaucrats but custodians of sacred knowledge, capable of capturing in ink and stone the words of gods and kings. The Maya word for scribe was its at, and the materials they worked with, bark paper books, painted ceramics, carved stone, required years of specialized training to master. Illustrations on classic Maya ceramics frequently show scribes at work, recognizable by their characteristic attributes, including what appeared to be writing tools tucked into their headdresses. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century and Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Maya books, describing them as the works of the devil, he was destroying not just texts but centuries of irreplaceable recorded knowledge. The role of women in classic Maya society was more significant and more varied than early Western scholarship assumed. While the Keohulajaw title was typically held by men, royal women were far from politically invisible. They appear on carved monuments, named and titled. They are described in hieroglyphic texts as performing ritual bloodletting, the essential cosmological maintenance work of Maya kingship. In some cases, women ruled as regents for underage sons, wielding real political power. Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, ruling in the late classic period, is a particularly striking example. A powerful queen who effectively became the political and military leader of Naranjo in a period of crisis, launching successful military campaigns and commissioning monuments that depicted her standing on the bent backs of defeated enemies. Women of non-royal noble families appear in the record as merchants, landholders, and ritual specialists. Among the commoner population, women's labor, particularly in textile production, was a significant component of the household economy. The commoner population, farmers, artisans, small-scale traders, laborers, made up the vast majority of the Maya world, probably somewhere around 90% of the total population. Their daily lives were organized around the agricultural calendar, the rhythm of planting and harvesting that was the material foundation of everything else the civilization produced. Maya farmers practiced a variety of agricultural techniques depending on their local environment. In areas with suitable topography, they built terraced fields on hillsides to prevent soil erosion and maximize cultivated area. In wetland areas, they constructed raised fields, elevated planting platforms surrounded by channels, effectively turning swamps into some of the most productive agricultural land available. In the lowland forests, slash-and-burn cultivation, clearing areas of jungle by cutting and burning, created temporarily fertile plots, though these required rotation and fallowing to remain productive. The markets of classic Maya cities were places of vivid social intersection, where the hierarchies of the wider society played out in the language of exchange. Long-distance prestige goods, jade ornaments, fine ceramics, cacao, rare feathers, decorated textiles, flowed through channels controlled by the nobility and the merchant class associated with them. But the day-to-day markets where commoners bought and sold food, tools, practical pottery, and locally produced goods were apparently vibrant and widespread, and modern archaeological evidence, including traces of market activity identified through chemical analysis of plaza soils at multiple classic Maya sites, suggests that market exchange was considerably more developed and central to the Maya economy than earlier scholars assumed. The ball game, called pits in classic Maya, deserves its own moment of attention. Played on a distinctive eye-shaped court with a solid rubber ball weighing several kilograms, the game was a pan-Mesoamerican institution with deep roots going back to at least 1000 BCE in the Maya world. The rubber ball was propelled using the hips, knees, and elbows, not hands or feet, and the physical skill required was substantial. But the game was far more than sport. Ball courts appear at virtually every significant Maya city, often in prominent locations adjacent to the main ceremonial plazas, because the game was a ritual enactment of cosmic conflict. The ball itself represented celestial bodies, the sun or the moon moving through the court as they moved through the sky. The game was played at significant calendar dates, and occasionally, though how frequently is still debated, the outcome was connected to human sacrifice. Some iconographic evidence suggests that in certain ritual contexts, losers of the game or high-status captives presented at the end of the game were killed, their blood offered to the gods who sustained the cosmic order. Human sacrifice was unambiguously a reality of classic Maya religious practice. It needs to be stated clearly. Usually at major calendar events and following important military victories. The blood and the lives of sacrificial victims were understood as offerings to the gods, payments made to maintain the cosmic contract on which the fertility of the land, the movement of the celestial bodies, and the continuation of time itself depended. This was a worldview in which violence was ritually incorporated rather than hidden, in which the boundary between life and death was understood as permeable and meaningful in ways that do not map cleanly onto modern Western sensibilities. Understanding this does not require approving of it, but it does require taking the Maya on their own terms, understanding what their practices meant within their own cosmological framework, rather than simply projecting modern moral categories onto a civilization that could not have imagined them. Let us also spend some time with the physical fabric of daily life in a classic Maya city, because the story of Maya civilization tends so naturally toward the dramatic. The kings and the pyramids, the wars and the sacrifices, that the texture of ordinary existence can get lost in the grandeur. The residential neighborhoods surrounding the ceremonial cores of major Maya cities were densely occupied. Houses were built on raised stone or earthen platforms to protect against flooding and to mark household territory. The platforms themselves were often carefully maintained over generations, with new constructions built over older ones as families grew and as the family's status and resources changed. A prosperous household might have several structures grouped around a small shared courtyard. Sleeping and storage rooms, a kitchen area, space for weaving or craft production. The household garden, planted with food crops, medicinal plants, and possibly fruit trees, blurred the line between domestic and agricultural space. The diet of ordinary Maya people was remarkably diverse despite the centrality of the maize-bean squash complex. Deer and other game animals, hunted in the forests surrounding the cities and towns, provided protein and prestige. Dogs were kept domesticated and eaten. The waters of the bajos and lakes yielded fish and freshwater shellfish. Wild plants supplemented the garden harvest. And cacao, the source of the chocolate drink that was probably the most prestigious beverage in the Maya world, was consumed in various preparations, from a frothy, bitter cold drink made by pouring chocolate liquid from height to incorporate air, to compounds mixed with vanilla, chili, and other flavorings. The famous Maya chocolate was not the sweetened confection familiar to modern consumers. Sugar was not a Maya ingredient, but it was intensely valued, used in ceremonies, offered to deities, and traded across enormous distances. Craft production was a significant activity at every social level in classic Maya cities. Weaving was primarily a female activity and was highly developed, producing cotton textiles of great sophistication and patterns that encoded social identity, the specific combinations of color and design that marked a wearer's community, status, and role. Pottery production ranged from utilitarian household ware to the extraordinarily refined polychrome painted ceramics produced in elite workshops for noble patrons, whose walls depicted mythological scenes, historical events, and portraits of the vessel's owners with the same visual sophistication as the stone monuments in the city's ceremonial plazas. Stoneworking, jade working, bone working, the production of shell ornaments, featherwork. The crafts of the Maya served both practical and symbolic functions, and many of them required years of specialized training. The artists and craftspeople who worked in elite workshops were not slaves but skilled specialists who occupied a recognized social niche, supported by noble patronage in exchange for their labor and expertise. Music and performance were integral to classic Maya ceremonial life in ways that the static stone monuments do not easily convey. Representations on ceramics and in murals show musicians playing drums of various sizes, rattles made from gourd, ceramic flutes and whistles, the sound of which was believed to attract and communicate with supernatural forces. The percussion instruments in particular, the great upright drums whose resonant voices could carry across a jungle plaza, marked important moments in the ceremonial calendar, announced the beginning of sacrificial rites, and marked the rhythmic steps of ritual dances performed by priests and rulers in elaborate costumes. The classic Maya world was a world of sound as well as stone, of movement and performance as well as monumental permanence. Of all the intellectual achievements of Maya civilization, and they are considerable, 3 stand out as genuinely transformative contributions to the history of human knowledge: the development of a complete and sophisticated writing system, the independent invention of zero and a positional number system, and the creation of an astronomical knowledge base of startling accuracy. These 3 achievements are so intertwined that they can barely be considered separately, because each one enabled and deepened the others. The Maya writing system is, by the consensus of scholars who study it, the most sophisticated and highly developed writing system ever created in the pre-Columbian Americas. It is a logosyllabic script, meaning that it uses a combination of logograms, signs that represent entire words or morphemes, and syllabic signs, signs that represent syllable sounds of the consonant-vowel type. A mixed system that allowed the encoding of the full complexity of spoken Maya language. The script contains approximately 800 distinct signs, though a core group of around 300 to 500 were in regular use during the Classic period. It was written in paired columns read from left to right and top to bottom, with a visual aesthetic of extraordinary power. The signs could be written in squared-off head variant forms, in more abstract geometric forms, or as full figure variants in which complete human or supernatural figures embodied the glyphs, creating inscriptions that were simultaneously text and monumental art. The earliest known examples of Maya hieroglyphic writing date to around the 3rd century BCE, found at San Bartolo in the Petén region of Guatemala, where painted murals discovered in 2005 pushed back the confirmed date of Maya literacy by several centuries. But the origins of the system are probably even earlier, reaching back into the interactions between the emerging Maya cultural sphere and the Olmec tradition that preceded it. By the Classic period, Maya writing was being used to record virtually everything of cultural importance. Genealogies of rulers, accounts of warfare and military victory, astronomical calculations, ritual calendars, mythological narratives, records of political alliances and tribute relationships. Scribes carved text into stone monuments. They painted it onto the stucco walls of buildings. They wrote it onto bark paper books. They inscribed it onto ceramics, into jade objects, onto the bones of sacrificial victims. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs is one of the great intellectual detective stories of the 20th century, and it has a somewhat melancholy historical dimension. The script that took modern scholars decades to decode was still being read by living Maya people as recently as the 17th century, before the cultural devastation of the Spanish colonial period severed the continuous transmission of that knowledge. The man most responsible for destroying that knowledge was also, paradoxically, the man most responsible for preserving enough information to eventually make decipherment possible. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop of Yucatan who in 1562 oversaw the burning of dozens if not hundreds of Maya bark paper books, an act he later acknowledged was a mistake of catastrophic cultural proportions, also wrote a detailed account of Maya life and language called The Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, which included a list of glyphs that Landa had asked a Maya informant to provide as an alphabet corresponding to Spanish letters. The result was confused and partial, because the Maya system was syllabic rather than alphabetic, and the informant's attempt to map syllabic signs onto alphabetic categories was inherently imperfect. But it preserved enough phonetic information that future scholars could work with it. The breakthrough in decipherment came from an unlikely direction in the early 1950s, when the Soviet scholar Yuri Norisov, working in Leningrad from published facsimiles of the surviving Maya codices in Landa's account, argued that the script was fundamentally phonetic, that the signs represented syllable sounds that could be combined to spell Maya words. This was a direct challenge to the then-dominant view, associated with the enormously influential American scholar J. Ericus Thompson, who believed that Maya glyphs were primarily ideographic, that they conveyed concepts rather than sounds. Thompson dismissed Norisov's work, partly on scholarly grounds and partly, it must be said, with a degree of Cold War-era hostility toward Soviet academics. But Norisov was right. Through the 1960s and 1970s, scholars including Tatiana Proskuryakov, who made the crucial discovery that certain groups of Mayan inscriptions actually recorded historical events in the lives of individual rulers, not abstract mythological content, and David Kelly began accumulating evidence that definitively established the phonetic nature of the script. By the 1980s, the phonetic approach was the established paradigm. Today, scholars can read somewhere above 90% of all surviving Maya hieroglyphic texts. What those texts reveal is a civilization far more politically complex, historically engaged, and humanly present than the mysterious Maya of popular imagination. The inscriptions do not primarily concern themselves with cosmic abstractions. They tell us, with remarkable specificity, about people. About a king named Chichén Itzá who defeated his rival in 695 CE and then commissioned a series of monuments to celebrate it. About a queen named Lady of Tikal who bridged two dynasties. About the scribe who painted a particular ceramic vessel and signed it. About the astronomical observations that confirmed a specific ritual date as cosmologically appropriate for a particular political act. Maya mathematics was built on a vigesimal, base 20, positional number system. Where our familiar decimal system uses 10 digits, 0 through 9, and assigns positional value based on powers of 10, the Mayan system used 3 symbols and assigned positional value based on powers of 20. A dot represented 1, a horizontal bar represented 5, and a shell-shaped symbol, perhaps the most consequential single symbol in the history of mathematical thought in the Americas, represented 0. The Maya concept and notation for 0 is among their most celebrated intellectual achievements. The development of a symbol to represent the absence of a quantity, a 0 that functions not merely as a placeholder but as a number in its own right, is one of those conceptual breakthroughs that seems obvious only in hindsight and was apparently extraordinarily difficult to arrive at. The Babylonians had something like a 0 placeholder. So did certain Indian mathematicians. But the Maya development of 0 as an explicitly notated concept, with its own symbol and its own place in a rigorous positional number system, stands as one of the independent inventions of this idea in human intellectual history, and it was being used in the Maya world long before 0 had been adopted in Europe. The utility of the 0-containing positional system for the Maya was immediately and practically apparent in their calendrical calculations. The long count calendar, which tracked absolute dates from a mythological creation point set at what corresponds to August 11, 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar, required the ability to count very large numbers, dates millions of days in the future or past, and a positional system with a 0 made such calculations manageable in ways that a Roman numeral-style additive system simply could not achieve. The 4 Maya books that survived the Spanish conquest, out of what must have been thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of bark paper books that existed before the conquest, are among the most precious artifacts in the history of human knowledge, and the story of their survival is partly one of accident, partly one of the ordinary bureaucratic patterns of colonial acquisition, and partly one of remarkable scholarly dedication over the centuries. The Dresden Codex, probably created around 900 years ago near Chichén Itzá, ended up in the Royal Library in Dresden, Germany, where the librarian Ernst Forstmann spent decades in the late 19th century working through its astronomical and calendrical content and eventually deciphering the Venus tables and the eclipse prediction tables. The Paris Codex, housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, appears to contain a Maya zodiac of some kind, though its full interpretation remains incomplete. The Madrid Codex, the longest of the surviving books, is housed in Madrid and contains almanacs and divination tables covering a wide range of activities and ritual occasions. The fourth codex, known as the Groye Codex and held in Mexico City, was only authenticated as genuine as recently as 1983 and contains additional astronomical content, including what appears to be another Venus table. Each of these 4 books represents an incalculable loss measured against what they contain. The Dresden Codex alone, with its Venus tables, eclipse tables, flood myths, and astronomical calculations, represents centuries of accumulated observational data, the intellectual product of generations of trained Maya astronomers. That 4 books survived where thousands were destroyed as a function of the colonial economy of curiosity and acquisition. European officials and travelers occasionally preserved materials as exotic curiosities, not because they grasped their cultural significance, while their companions and colleagues burned everything else they could find. The systematic book burning that Diego de Landa carried out in 1562 at Mani in the Yucatan, an event he later described with some regret but defended as necessary for the salvation of Maya souls from pagan practices, destroyed an unknowable quantity of irreplaceable knowledge. He reported burning 27 hieroglyphic books and 5,000 idols on a single afternoon. The cultural violence of that act echoes through every subsequent attempt to understand Maya civilization. Maya astronomy was built over centuries of systematic observation and record-keeping, and the results were of genuinely extraordinary accuracy. The Maya solar year calculation, the number of days it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun, was known to the Maya with an error of only a fraction of a day. Their calculation of the Venus synodical period, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, was 584 days, extremely close to the actual value of 583.92 days. This calculation is preserved in the Dresden Codex. The Dresden Codex's Venus tables, which tracked Venus through its phases as morning star, its disappearance, its reappearance as evening star, and its second disappearance, cycling through 584-day periods, represent the product of generations of systematic naked-eye observation, mathematical calculation, and careful record-keeping. The phases break down as follows. Venus appears as the morning star for approximately 236 days, disappears on the far side of the Sun for about 90 days, reappears as the evening star for around 250 days, and then disappears again for about 8 days while passing between the Earth and the Sun. These specific numbers, 236, 90, 258, appear in the Dresden Codex as Venus tables with a precision that continues to astonish astronomers who examine them today. Venus was not merely an astronomical curiosity for the Maya, it was a deity of tremendous power and political significance. The heliacal rising of Venus as the morning star, the first appearance of Venus on the eastern horizon before sunrise, after a period of invisibility, was associated with war and with the god who embodied that connection, sometimes called the Star Wars glyph by modern epigraphers. Military campaigns were timed to coincide with Venus's movements. The appearance of Venus as evening star carried different associations. The planet's dual role as both morning star and evening star, two seemingly different objects that the Maya recognized as the same celestial body, an identification that required centuries of careful observation to make, encoded a symbolism of duality, death, and rebirth that resonated deeply with Maya cosmological thought. Eclipse tables also appear in the Dresden Codex, systematic records that allowed Maya astronomers to predict the occurrence of solar and lunar eclipses with remarkable reliability. The method was empirical rather than theoretically derived. By recording eclipse events over long periods and identifying repeating patterns in the intervals between them, the Maya could project those patterns forward to anticipate future eclipses. This predictive capability had enormous practical importance in a society where celestial events were understood as communications from the gods and where the failure to prepare appropriately for such events would have been seen as catastrophic negligence on the part of the ruling class. The ability to predict eclipses was, in the most direct sense, a form of political power. The three calendars that the Maya used simultaneously formed a system of extraordinary intricacy. The Hab, the civil calendar, was a 365-day solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days each plus a 5-day period called the Wayeb, days considered particularly dangerous and unlucky. That Sokin, the ritual or sacred calendar, was a 260-day cycle made up of 13 numbers cycling through 20 named days, producing a unique combination for each of the 260 days before the cycle repeated. The calendar round combined these two systems into a 52-year cycle, after which both the Hab and the Sokin returned simultaneously to their starting positions. And the long count counted absolute days from the mythological creation date, enabling the precise dating of events across millennia and the embedding of any given moment in its vast temporal context. To understand Maya religion is to understand something genuinely different from the religious frameworks of the ancient Mediterranean, the Near East, or East Asia. Different not in the sense of inferior or irrational, but different in its specific cosmological architecture, in the particular ways it organized the relationship between the human world and the supernatural, and in the kinds of obligations it placed on both rulers and ordinary people. Maya religion was not a separate domain of life. It was the framework within which all of life occurred. The sky was not simply weather and stars, it was a living text, constantly communicating to those with the knowledge to read it. The earth was not merely ground, it was a living body, with caves as its mouth and cenotes as its eyes. The forests were not just trees, they were populated by beings of various kinds, some helpful, some dangerous, most simply present and part of the web of relationships that constituted the world. At the center of the Maya cosmological architecture was the world tree, called the Huacachán in classic Maya inscriptions, often depicted as a great ceiba tree, the tallest tree in the tropical forest. The world tree stood at the axis of the universe, connecting the three realms of Maya cosmology: the upper world, home to celestial deities, stars, and the divine forces that govern the movements of the heavens; the middle world, the earthly realm where humans, animals, plants, and the ordinary supernatural beings of the landscape coexisted; and the underworld, called Xibalba, a realm beneath the earth governed by the lords of death and disease and darkness. The world tree's roots extended into Xibalba. Its trunk rose through the middle world. Its canopy spread through the 13 layers of the upper world. Through its hollow trunk, or through the network of caves and cenotes that penetrated the limestone bedrock, it was possible for spirits, ancestors, and determined living beings to travel between the realms. The 13 layers of the upper world were ruled by distinct deities and had their own characters and qualities. The 9 levels of Xibalba, the underworld, were each associated with specific trials and specific supernatural lords whose names describe their domains. 1 Death and 7 Death, the supreme lords of Xibalba, Scab Stripper and Blood Gatherer, Demon of Pus and Demon of Jaundice, Bone Scepter and Skull Scepter. These were not simply allegorical figures. For the classic Maya, Xibalba was a real place, accessible through the cave mouths that punctuated the Yucatan landscape in the cenotes, natural sinkholes in the limestone, whose dark water descended into the underworld's depths. Archaeological investigation of numerous cave sites in cenotes across the Maya world has recovered clear evidence of ritual use. Offerings of jade, pottery, incense, and human remains left in places understood as portals to the world below. At the cave of Acton Tunakil Muknal in Belize, for example, the remains of sacrificial victims have been found deep within the cave system. The calcite that slowly forms over centuries having partially encrusted the bones with a crystalline coating that gives them an otherworldly appearance. The Maya creation narrative, preserved most fully in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Kich, Maya recorded in alphabetic script around 1550 CE from what was already an ancient oral tradition, is one of the great creation myths in world literature. The Popol Vuh describes the gods' repeated attempts to create human beings who could pray to them and maintain the cosmic order. First from mud, which dissolved. Then from wood, which was rigid and incapable of honoring the gods. The wooden people were destroyed in a great flood and by the rebellion of the objects they had mistreated. Finally, the gods succeeded in making human beings from ground white and yellow maize, kneaded with water. These were the first true humans, and they were made so well that they could see everything, the entire universe laid out before them. Until the gods, afraid of creating beings too close to themselves in perception and understanding, clouded the human vision slightly, like breathing on a mirror. This founding act of creative adjustment, the gods deliberately limiting human perception to maintain the proper distinction between divine and mortal, is one of the most philosophically resonant moments in the entire text. The Popol Vuh also contains the story of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Palenque, and their descent into Xibalba, which is at once the central narrative of Maya mythology and the mythological template through which the ball game, human sacrifice, and the movement of celestial bodies were all understood and interpreted. The story begins before the hero twins are born, with their father Hun Hunahpu and his brother Vucub Hunahpu, who were great ball players. Playing loudly on the road that led to the underworld, they disturbed the lords of Xibalba, who summoned them down. The brothers descended and faced a series of terrifying trials. A house of darkness, a house of razors, a house of cold, a house of fire, a house of jaguars, but ultimately failed and were sacrificed by the Xibalban lords. Hun Hunahpu's severed head was hung in a calabash tree as a trophy. When a young woman named Exquic approached the tree, the head spoke to her and spit into her palm, magically impregnating her with the hero twins. Hunahpu and Palenque grew up in the upper world, eventually discovering their father's ballgame equipment and resuming the game that had originally summoned the Xibalban lords. They were called down to Xibalba as their father had been, but they navigated the trials with cunning rather than falling into the same traps. They even survived a night in the House of Bats, though Hunahpu temporarily lost his head to the bat deity Kamisats before having it magically restored by his twin brother. Eventually the hero twins outwitted and defeated the lords of Xibalba, not through force but through cleverness. They performed a feat of apparent resurrection, sacrificing themselves and then coming back to life, which so delighted the lords of Xibalba that the twins did the trick again, this time killing the Xibalban lords without bringing them back. With the lords of death defeated, the order of the cosmos was restored. The hero twins ascended to the sky, where they became the sun and the moon, or in some versions the sun and Venus, cycling across the heavens in the pattern that the Maya had been observing and recording for centuries. The mythological connection between the ball game and this cosmic narrative is direct and intentional. Every Maya ball court was, on a fundamental level, a stage on which this cosmic drama could be reenacted. The heavy rubber ball was the sun or the moon or Venus, a celestial body moving through the court as celestial bodies moved through the sky. The players were participants in a ritual that echoed the hero twins' cosmic contest with the lords of death. The outcome could be connected to sacrifice, the shedding of blood that maintained the cosmic machinery and kept time moving forward. Bloodletting as ritual practice ran through every level of classic Maya society but was most centrally associated with the Kayuhulajaw and the noble class. The divine king's blood was uniquely potent. His special relationship to the supernatural gave his offering a cosmological power that ordinary blood did not possess. Classic Maya iconography includes numerous representations of rulers drawing blood from their tongues with stingray spines, from their penises with obsidian blades, and offering the blood-soaked papers to the fire, sending the spiritual essence of their offering up to the waiting gods in smoke. These were not merely symbolic gestures. They were, in Maya understanding, the essential maintenance work of the universe. They were what kept the rain coming, the sun rising, the maize growing. The pantheon of Maya gods was vast, fluid, and resists easy systematization. Different city-states had their own patron deities. Gods manifested in multiple aspects and could be conflated with each other in ways that resist the neat taxonomic separations that modern scholars would prefer. But a few major figures stand out across the classic period. Itzamna, Lizard House, was the supreme deity of the Maya pantheon, the original creator, associated with scribal knowledge, divination, and the ordering of time. The maize god, whose resurrection from the underworld mirrored the annual cycle of the maize plant dying into the earth and sprouting again, was one of the most universally important figures in the classic Maya world. Chichén tomb lid depicted him explicitly as the maize god at the moment of death and rebirth. Chalk, the rain god, whose long curved nose and propensity for lightning and water appear everywhere in Maya iconography, was the deity most immediately and urgently relevant to farmers whose lives depended on seasonal rainfall. Kawil, associated with royal lineage, lightning, and fertility, often depicted with a serpent for one leg and a burning torch in his forehead. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, cognate with the central Mexican deity Quetzalcoatl, who would become increasingly important in the Postclassic period. The physical landscape of the Maya world was saturated with sacred meaning. Mountains were not simply topography, they were the bodies of earth deities, and the stone-faced pyramids that Maya cities built were artificial mountains, replicas in stone of the sacred hills where ancestors and gods resided. The corbelled chambers inside the pyramids were caves, artificial entrances to the underworld, places where the boundary between the living and the dead was particularly thin, where the dead king could be properly placed in communication with both the ancestors and the forces below. Every architectural choice encoded a cosmological statement. Every building was a model of the universe it was meant to maintain. The question has haunted scholars for more than a century. Why did the great cities of the classic Maya disappear? How does a civilization that had been producing extraordinary achievements in architecture, art, writing, and astronomical knowledge for 600 years simply stop? The archaeological record is stark. In the late 8th and 9th centuries CE, one after another, the great urban centers of the southern Maya lowlands ceased to erect dated stone monuments. Construction of major buildings stopped. Population declined sharply. The plazas that had hosted thousands of people for royal ceremonies fell silent. The jungle moved in. And within a generation or two, the descendants of the people who had built these cities were living in much smaller, simpler communities, or had left the area entirely. It is worth being precise about what collapse actually means in this context, because the word carries connotations of sudden catastrophe that are not entirely accurate. The terminal classic period, roughly 800 to 950 CE, is the period over which most of the major southern lowland cities declined and were abandoned. This was a process that unfolded over roughly 150 years, not a single cataclysmic event. Different cities declined at different times and at different rates. Some cities that showed dramatic decline in the early 9th century continued to have some activity into the 10th. Others collapsed more abruptly. The regional pattern was messy and complex, with the southern lowlands hit hardest while many cities in the northern Yucatan and on the coast continued to flourish or even grew more powerful as southern populations dispersed. More than 80 distinct theories or variations of theories have been proposed to explain the classic Maya collapse, which gives some sense of both the complexity of the phenomenon and the passion that it has inspired among scholars. The current scholarly consensus, such as it is, favors a multi-causal explanation, the understanding that no single factor was responsible, that instead a combination of stresses converged in a way that overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of Maya political institutions. Three factors appear most consistently in the evidence: prolonged drought, intensified warfare, and the failure of divine kingship as a governing system. The drought evidence is, at this point, quite compelling. Paleoclimatic data gathered from lake sediment cores, cave stalagmites, and other environmental proxies across the Yucatan Peninsula has consistently demonstrated that the terminal classic period was characterized by a series of severe, extended droughts. Sediment analysis from Lake Chichén Itzá on the Yucatan Peninsula, published in a landmark 1995 study, showed an intense protracted drought coinciding with the collapse period. More recent analysis, using the isotopic composition of water trapped in gypsum crystals formed in lakes during drought periods, found that annual precipitation decreased between 41 and 54% during the collapse period, with some intervals showing reductions of up to 70%. A study published in the journal PNAS found evidence of 8 severe droughts during the terminal classic period, each lasting between 3 and 18 years. Isotopic analysis of stalagmites from Belizean caves has corroborated this picture, providing high-resolution records of rainfall going back centuries. The overall picture is one of a landscape that, during precisely the period when the classic Maya political structure was collapsing, was experiencing the driest conditions it had seen in 7,000 years. But drought alone cannot explain the full complexity of the collapse pattern, and critics of the mega-drought explanation have raised legitimate points. The northern Yucatan also experienced drought during this period, yet northern cities continued to function. The drought cannot easily explain why some cities collapsed while others in similar climate zones survived. And not all researchers are convinced that the drought evidence from the northern Yucatan adequately represents conditions in the southern lowlands where the major collapses occurred. Warfare offers a complementary explanation. The late classic period saw a marked intensification of conflict between Maya city-states. The diplomatic alliances and strategic relationships that had governed intercity relations during the earlier classic period began to break down. Evidence of defensive fortifications, stone walls, ditches, barriers, begins to appear at cities that had previously been architecturally open. Arrowheads and other weapon elements appear in context suggesting that warfare was becoming more frequent and more destructive. The pattern of destruction at some sites, combined with the cessation of monument erecting activity at specific datable points in the late Classic, allows archaeologists in some cases to connect military defeats directly to the beginning of a city's decline. The most interesting and perhaps most intellectually compelling theory of the collapse focuses not on environmental or military factors per se, but on the political system that failed to respond adequately to them. The institution of divine kingship, which had been the organizing principle of classic Maya political life for centuries, was built on a specific bargain between rulers and their subjects. The king performed the rituals, drew the blood, maintained cosmic order, and in return the universe cooperated. The rains came, the harvests were adequate, the city prospered. When the rains failed year after year, this bargain collapsed. The king could not deliver on his end. No amount of additional sacrifice, no more elaborate ceremonies, no greater quantities of blood could make the sky open. And when the ideology that justified the ruler's power failed to match observable reality, the political system built on that ideology began to crack. Archaeological evidence for what this looked like on the ground includes the cessation of monument erection, the public statement that a ruler's time and achievements were worth commemorating, and the apparent failure of elite building programs in the late 8th and early 9th centuries at many sites. At Copán, where deforestation had already severely degraded the agricultural capacity of the valley by the late Classic, the ruling dynasty erected its last dated monument in 822 CE. Tikal's last long count inscription dates to 869 CE. Palenque appears to have been largely abandoned by the early 9th century. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, erected its last monument in 909 CE, one of the last classic Mayan inscriptions in the southern lowlands. The great cities, each in their own time and through their own combination of pressures, fell silent. The abandonment of the southern lowland cities was not simply a depopulation. It was a political transformation. The people did not all die. Many migrated. Population moved northward toward the Yucatan Peninsula, where water was more accessible through the cenote systems and where a different kind of Maya political organization was emerging. Others retreated to smaller, more sustainable communities in the highlands and along the coasts. The great classic Maya experiment with divine kingship, monumental architecture, and intensive lowland agriculture came to an end. But the Maya did not end. The civilization transformed. And in the north, it was preparing for a new chapter. There is one more dimension of the collapse that deserves attention because it tends to be underemphasized in popular accounts: the environmental damage that the Maya themselves inflicted on their landscape over the centuries of their florescence. The LiDAR surveys that have so dramatically expanded our understanding of Maya settlement density have also made it clear that the scale of forest clearance, soil disturbance, and landscape modification was enormous. Pollen cores from lake sediments across the Maya lowlands show the signature of deforestation, the dramatic decline in tree pollen and the corresponding rise in pollen from grasses and crops, occurring over centuries as population grew and the demand for agricultural land increased. At some cities, particularly Copán and Honduras, there is strong evidence that the surrounding landscape had been so thoroughly deforested by the late Classic that severe soil erosion was already underway, degrading agricultural land and silting up the valley with eroded material that reduced its agricultural productivity just as population was reaching its peak. This pattern of environmental degradation interacted with drought in a feedback loop that would have been genuinely catastrophic. When forests are cleared, the hydrological cycle of a landscape changes. Trees transpire enormous quantities of water, contributing to the local rainfall that maintains humidity and moderates temperature extremes. Remove the trees and the local climate becomes drier and more variable. Remove the trees and the soil, no longer anchored by root systems and protected from direct rainfall impact by the forest canopy, erodes more readily. Remove the trees and the carbon stored in their biomass is released into the atmosphere, potentially contributing to regional warming. The Maya deforestation, at the scale revealed by the LiDAR surveys, may have created a regional environmental crisis that amplified the severity of the climate droughts and made recovery much harder even when conditions improved. The lesson that some scholars have drawn from this, about the fragility of complex civilizations that outrun their environmental resource base, has obvious contemporary relevance, though drawing direct analogies between ancient and modern environmental crises requires care. The social dimensions of the collapse, too, deserve more than a passing mention. The vast majority of classic Maya society, the farmers, the craftspeople, the market vendors, the village-level specialists, were not personally invested in the continuation of divine kingship in the way that the elite class was. As the late Classic period progressed and the stresses of drought, warfare, and resource depletion intensified, there is evidence that the social contract between the ruling class and the wider population was fraying. The construction of ever more elaborate royal monuments, pyramids that required massive inputs of labor to build, even as food supplies were becoming less reliable, may have generated resentment and resistance among the populations being mobilized for that labor. Some scholars have proposed that social revolt, commoners refusing to continue supporting elite building programs, perhaps actively destroying monuments and symbols of royal authority, contributed to the collapse in some cities. The evidence for this is less direct than the evidence for drought or warfare, but it fits within a model where multiple stresses converge simultaneously, overwhelming the governing capacity of a political system that had been optimized for conditions that no longer obtained. While the great cities of the southern lowlands were entering their terminal phase in the 9th century, the northern Yucatan was experiencing something quite different. Rather than collapse, the north was consolidating. Rather than abandonment, it was growth. The political and cultural center of the Maya world was shifting geographically, and in that shift, the civilization was also reshaping itself institutionally, developing new forms of governance, new economic structures, and new religious orientations that were distinctly post-classic in character. The most spectacular expression of this northern renaissance was the city of Chichén Itzá. Located in the eastern portion of the Yucatan Peninsula, Chichén Itzá was already a functioning city during the Classic period, but it was during the terminal Classic and into the early Post-Classic, roughly 800 to 1100 CE, that it grew to become the dominant power in the northern Maya lowlands, arguably the largest and most important Maya city of its era. At its peak, Chichén Itzá was home to perhaps as many as 35,000 people, and it controlled an extensive regional network through both political authority and economic power. The architecture of Chichén Itzá is immediately striking to any visitor because it looks, in certain respects, unlike the classic Maya cities of the south. The Great Pyramid known as El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, is a structure of extraordinary geometric precision and astronomical intentionality. It has 4 sides, each with 91 steps, which combined with the single step at the top platform produces exactly 365 steps, the number of days in the solar year. The pyramid is oriented so that during the spring and fall equinoxes, the angle of the setting sun creates a remarkable shadow effect on the northern staircase, a series of triangular shadows that, in combination with the carved serpent heads at the base, creates the appearance of a feathered serpent undulating down the staircase. This is not accident. It is intentional solar engineering, the product of sophisticated astronomical knowledge translated into stone. El Caracol, the snail, is an observatory, an unusual round structure whose windows align with specific astronomical sight lines for tracking the movements of Venus and other celestial bodies. The Temple of the Warriors is surrounded by a forest of carved columns, over 1,000 of them, giving the site its alternative name, the Thousand Columns Complex. The sacred cenote, the great natural sinkhole at Chichén Itzá, was a site of pilgrimage and sacrifice for centuries, When archaeologists dredged it in the early 20th century, they recovered gold discs imported from as far away as Colombia and Panama, jade objects, pottery, incense balls, and human skeletal remains, all thrown into the water as offerings to the rain god Chak, who was understood to reside in these underground water sources. The architectural style at Chichén Itzá shows what appears to be strong influence from, or close relationship with, the central Mexican city of Tula and the Toltec tradition. The feathered serpent imagery, the warrior figures known as shakmals, the colonnade architecture. These features appear both at Chichén Itzá and at Tula, and the relationship between the two sites has been debated by scholars for decades. What the presence of these elements tells us is that the post-classic Maya were more thoroughly connected to the wider Mesoamerican world, to the cultures of central Mexico, to the Gulf Coast, to cultures far to the south, than the classic period emphasis on lowland cultural autonomy might suggest. The post-classic was an era of intensified long-distance interaction, and Chichén Itzá was one of the great nodes in that expanded network. After Chichén Itzá declined as a regional capital around 1100 CE, the reasons are somewhat murky, but involve the rise of a competing power base. The center of political gravity in northern Yucatan shifted to Mayapan. Mayapan was a fundamentally different kind of Maya city from the great classic centers. It was walled, enclosed within a roughly circular defensive wall nearly 9 kilometers in circumference, a feature with no parallel in the classic Maya world, suggesting both a more militarized political environment and a different conception of urban space. Its ceremonial architecture was less monumentally ambitious than at Tikal or Palenque. The central pyramid, clearly modeled on El Castillo at Chichén Itzá but significantly smaller, was a statement of symbolic continuity rather than architectural innovation. But what Mayapan built was a different kind of political system. The governance of Mayapan was centered not on a single divine king but on a council of noble families, specifically the Calakmul lineage, which controlled the city and forced the leaders of other noble lineages from across the Yucatan to reside at Mayapan, essentially keeping them as political hostages while allowing them nominal authority over their own territories. This council-based governance was a distinct departure from classic Maya divine kingship, and it reflected a broader post-classic trend across the Maya world, the delegitimization of the divine king model following the classic collapse, and the emergence of collective or oligarchic governance structures as replacements. At Chichén Itzá, the same pattern had appeared. The city's political organization seemed to rely on a kind of ruling council rather than a single hereditary monarch. Mayapan held its dominant position in northern Yucatan for roughly 250 years, from about 1200 to 1450 CE. Then it too collapsed, in a dramatic episode involving the assassination of the ruling Calakmul lineage by their Xiul rivals, followed by political chaos, warfare, and the fragmentation of Yucatecan politics into a patchwork of competing independent provinces. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they found a Yucatan deeply divided, its great unified states things of the past, its population living in smaller towns and farming communities, the old ceremonial centers maintained as sacred places but no longer the political hubs they had once been. The post-classic economic transformation deserves special mention because it represents a genuinely significant restructuring of how Maya society organized its material life. The classic period had been an economy substantially organized around the exchange of prestige goods, jade, quetzal feathers, fine ceramics, cacao in elite contexts, with trade networks controlled by noble lineages who used control of luxury goods as a tool of political differentiation. The post-classic saw a shift toward what archaeologists describe as a more broadly commercialized economy, oriented more around utilitarian commodities, salt, cotton textiles, obsidian for everyday tools, dried fish, honey, traded through coastal sea routes that linked the Gulf of Mexico coast, the Caribbean coast, and the Pacific coast of Central America in a vast maritime trading system. This shift to coastal and sea-based trade was politically significant as well as economically transformative. The great inland cities of the classic period, Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul, had been positioned to control overland trade routes. The post-classic coastal cities were positioned to exploit sea routes that moved goods faster, in greater volumes, and with less dependence on the specific political conditions of any inland corridor. The famous encounter that Christopher Columbus had in 1502 during his fourth voyage, when he intercepted a large Maya trading canoe off the coast of Honduras, gives us a vivid glimpse of this post-classic maritime economy in action. The canoe was laden with trade goods, had a large crew of paddlers, and was clearly operating as a professional long-distance trading vessel. Columbus reportedly took the canoe's captain aboard his own ship to question him, and what he described was a sophisticated commercial network extending hundreds of kilometers along the Central American coast. The religious life of the post-classic Maya showed its own distinctive character. The elaborate patron deity cult of the classic period, each city-state with its own hieroglyphic emblem glyph, its own ruling dynasty, its own specific cosmological framework embedded in a massive investment in stone monuments, gave way to a more widely shared pan-Mesoamerican religious vocabulary that was partly the result of the increased interconnection of the post-classic world. The feathered serpent deity, known as Kukulkan in Maya and Quetzalcoatl in Nahuatl, became a unifying symbol that appeared from the Yucatan to central Mexico. Household shrines and smaller-scale ritual objects became more common relative to massive state religious architecture. The role of the ritual specialist as an intermediary with the supernatural, a role that had been heavily concentrated in the person of the divine king during the classic period, dispersed somewhat, becoming more accessible to practitioners at various levels of society. The Spanish conquest, when it came, encountered a Maya world that had been through several centuries of transformation since the classic collapse. A world very different from the one that had built Tikal or Palenque, but no less complex, no less sophisticated, and no less deeply invested in the survival of Maya cultural identity. The resistance that the Spanish encountered, and the nearly 200 years it took to complete the conquest, culminating only in 1697 with the fall of the last independent Maya kingdom, testifies to the tenacity with which Maya communities defended not just their political independence but their ways of life. The loss of that independence was catastrophic. But it was not final. In the highlands of Guatemala, a different post-classic story was unfolding. The Quiché Maya had built an expansive kingdom centered on their capital Camarquich, controlling large swaths of the western highland region. Their sacred book, the Popol Vuh, was probably composed in something close to its current form during this period, preserving mythological and historical traditions of deep antiquity in a political context where cultural identity and legitimacy had to be actively maintained against both internal competition and external pressure. The Kaqchikal, the Tz'utujil, and other highland groups maintained their own kingdoms, often in intense competition with the Quiché. It was a world of intense political fragmentation but also of cultural vitality. The Spanish conquest of the Maya was an extraordinarily prolonged affair, not the rapid military triumph that the conquest of the Aztec Empire had been. The Maya kingdoms were fragmented and independent, which meant there was no single nerve center to sever. The Spanish had to defeat each polity separately, and many of them fought back ferociously. The Yucatan campaign began in earnest in 1528 under Francisco de Montejo and his son, and it took more than a decade of brutal fighting, including a catastrophic Spanish defeat at Chichén Itzá where over 150 conquistadors were killed in a single day, before Yucatan was nominally subdued. The highland kingdoms of Guatemala fell to Pedro de Alvarado in 1524, including the Quiché capital after the legendary resistance of their war leader Tikal. The last independent Maya kingdom, the Itzá Maya of the Petén region, centered on the island city of Nochpetén and Lake Petén Itzá, was not defeated until 1697, nearly 2 centuries after the initial Spanish contact. The Maya were, in the most literal and historical sense, the last great Mesoamerican civilization to fall to European conquest. No discussion of the Maya is complete without confronting the remarkable persistence of distorted and sensationalized narratives about this civilization in popular culture, and then clearing them away to reveal what makes the actual story so much more extraordinary and so much more human. The 2012 phenomenon was, in retrospect, a fascinating cultural event in its own right, but it had almost nothing to do with the actual ancient Maya. The claim that the Maya had predicted the end of the world on December 21, 2012 rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Maya calendar, and in some ways on a deliberate misrepresentation of it by New Age authors seeking to exploit public fascination with an ancient civilization they understood poorly. What actually happened on December 21, 2012 was that the Maya long count calendar completed a major cycle called a Bacton, specifically the 13th Bacton, which contained approximately 1,872,000 days, or roughly 5,125 years. The calendar then simply reset and began counting again. There is, in the actual Mayan inscriptions, no statement that this cyclical reset would coincide with the end of the world. Quite the contrary. Archaeological discoveries at the site of Zoltan in Guatemala in 2012, made just months before the supposed doomsday date, revealed the oldest and most complete Maya astronomical tables ever found, which extended at least 7,000 years into the future. The ancient Maya were not predicting an ending. They were planning for continuation. As Sandra Noble, executive director of the Foundation for the Advancement of Mesoamerican Studies, said plainly, for the ancient Maya, It was a huge celebration to make it to the end of a whole cycle. The 2012 Doomsday Narrative was a Western projection, a reflection of Western apocalypticism, granted onto a non-Western calendar system by people who had no serious engagement with Maya scholarship. When the date came and went without incident, it was not the Maya who were embarrassed. And the scholar William Saturno of Boston University, one of the leading Maya archaeologists, noted with dry precision that even if the ancient inscriptions had explicitly predicted catastrophe, he personally would not have been overly concerned about the Maya's track record with long-range prophecy, given that they did not predict their own classic collapse and did not see the Spanish conquest coming. The ancient astronauts hypothesis, the claim that Maya architectural achievements were so extraordinary that they must have been assisted by extraterrestrial intelligence, is a racist idea in a sci-fi disguise. At its core, the argument is that the people of the Americas, being indigenous and brown, could not possibly have built what they built without outside help. But outside help in this version of the story is not from neighboring cultures or from accumulated indigenous knowledge and ingenuity. It is from aliens. The implication is clear. These people were not sophisticated enough, not intelligent enough, to have done this themselves. This is, of course, directly contradicted by everything the archaeological and historical record tells us. Maya pyramid construction required sophisticated organizational capacity, mathematical planning, and the application of engineering principles developed through generations of cumulative knowledge. It did not require extraterrestrials. The Palenque astronaut, Peko's sarcophagus lid, is not a man in a spacecraft. It is a Maya king on the world tree, depicted in a visual language whose iconographic grammar has been thoroughly documented and cross-referenced across hundreds of classic Maya contexts. The astronaut interpretation requires ignoring all of that context in favor of a superficial visual analogy that flatters a specific modern technology at the expense of a sophisticated ancient visual tradition. What the Maya actually achieved is already so astonishing that it needs no extraterrestrial embellishment. They independently invented zero. They built cities of tens of thousands of people in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, without wheels, without iron, without draft animals, sustaining those cities through agricultural innovation of remarkable ingenuity. They mapped Venus with naked-eye accuracy over centuries. They developed one of the most complex writing systems in human history. They created a body of mythological and cosmological literature of profound philosophical depth. They organized a civilization that persisted, adapted, and transformed across more than 3,000 years. The aliens hypothesis doesn't honor the Maya, it diminishes them. The revolution in Maya archaeology over the past few decades has come not from science fiction but from science. The deployment of LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing method that uses laser pulses to map terrain beneath vegetation, has completely transformed our understanding of the scale, complexity, and interconnectedness of ancient Maya settlement. In 2009, the first successful application of LiDAR over jungle terrain was at the Maya city of Calakmul in Belize, where the scan revealed the full extent of a city that researchers working on the ground had been studying for decades. The city turned out to be far larger than anyone had previously mapped, more than 200 square kilometers of continuous urban settlement, with causeways and agricultural terraces extending far beyond the visible ceremonial core. Then, in 2018, the Pocunum LiDAR Initiative, a collaboration between the Guatemalan Foundation for Maya Cultural and Natural Heritage and international partners, released results from surveys covering more than 2,100 square kilometers of the Maya Biosphere Reserve in northern Guatemala. The results were stunning. The scans revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown structures. Houses, palaces, raised highways, water management systems, agricultural terraces, defensive fortifications. Archaeologist Marcelo Canudo of Tulane University described the impact as analogous to what astronomers felt when the Hubble Space Telescope first revealed the full depth of the universe. Francisco Estrada-Belli, also of Tulane, said more directly that LiDAR is revolutionizing archaeology the way the Hubble revolutionized astronomy. Thomas Garrison of Ithaca College noted that the LiDAR data made clear that the region's settlement density had been grossly underestimated. What the LiDAR data revealed was not merely a larger Maya world but a fundamentally different one. Previous scholarship had often conceptualized the classic Maya as a network of scattered urban centers surrounded by relatively sparsely populated agricultural hinterland, a model influenced partly by the appearance of the landscape as seen from ground level, which gave little indication of the extent of human modification beneath the jungle canopy. The LiDAR scans revealed something much more like a fully settled landscape, with continuous human occupation across vast areas, interconnected by an extensive road network of raised causeways that linked cities, quarries, agricultural areas, and smaller settlements into a coherent system. The scale of landscape modification, the terracing, the raised fields, the drainage systems, the deliberate reshaping of wetlands for agricultural purposes, was far greater than had been imagined. In 2024, a newly discovered city dubbed Valeriana was identified in LiDAR data from the Mexican state of Campeche, containing nearly 7,000 structures and revealing that even areas previously described as archaeological blank spots in the Maya lowlands were extensively settled. At Tikal specifically, LiDAR surveys have revealed that the city was at least 4 times larger than the site's previously mapped extent. A complex network of roads, terraced fields, reservoirs, and defensive fortifications spreading far beyond the core ceremonial zone that tourists visit today. The city that Tikal's own inhabitants knew was vastly bigger, more densely populated, and more deeply shaped by human activity than the visible ruins on the surface suggested. Every major Maya city that has been subjected to comprehensive LiDAR survey has yielded similar surprises. Each one larger, more connected, and more thoroughly transformed its landscape than ground-based research had been able to show. These discoveries have a direct bearing on how we understand the classic Maya collapse, too. A landscape that was not sparsely populated but densely settled, extensively deforested, and heavily cultivated would have been considerably more vulnerable to the kinds of environmental stresses, drought, soil erosion, the disruption of local water cycles through deforestation, that the terminal classic period brought. The Maya were not a small population managing a sustainable relationship with a largely intact forest ecosystem. They were a large and dense population that had profoundly modified their landscape over centuries in ways that, when combined with the climate stress of the 9th century, may have produced a cascade of interconnected failures that no individual city, however powerful, had the capacity to withstand alone. And yet the Maya endured. This is perhaps the most important thing to say, and it is often the thing that gets most neglected in the dramatic narratives of collapse and abandonment that dominate popular accounts of Maya civilization. The classic Maya did not vanish. Their cities were left behind, but the people themselves continued, adapted, resettled, reorganized, and survived. The post-classic period was not a post-apocalyptic wasteland but a living civilization, reorganized around different centers and different political structures. The Spanish conquest of the 16th and 17th centuries was an enormous trauma, bringing epidemic disease that killed enormous fractions of the indigenous population, forced conversion, destruction of cultural materials, suppression of indigenous political structures, and centuries of colonial exploitation. But even that did not end the Maya as a people. Today, estimates of the living Maya population range from 6 to 7 million people, living primarily in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. They speak more than 30 distinct Maya languages, from Yucatec Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula to Kitch and Kaqchikal in the Guatemalan highlands to Mam and Tzotzil and Celtal and dozens of others. Roughly 40% of Guatemala's population is of Maya descent. In many highland Maya communities, traditional practices related to agriculture, weaving, ceremony, and the reckoning of time according to the 260-day Tzolk'in calendar persist with a vitality that has survived 5 centuries of pressure to abandon them. Maya daykeepers, practitioners called Achkaijab and Kitch, continue to maintain and transmit the sacred calendar that their ancestors observed in the Preclassic period, connecting the present to a path that stretches back more than 3,000 years. The Maya language itself carries the ancient knowledge in ways that archaeological excavation cannot fully reach. The ecological terminology embedded in Maya languages, the dozens of words for different kinds of maize, the detailed classification of forest plants and their medicinal uses, the vocabulary of astronomical observation, represents knowledge accumulated and refined over millennia, transmitted from generation to generation not in books or inscriptions but in the living breath of speech. When linguists record and analyze these languages, they are accessing a form of archive whose depth rivals anything carved in stone. The relationship between modern Maya communities and the ancient past is complex and should not be romanticized. Modern Maya people are not simply guardians of a preserved pre-Columbian culture, frozen in time. They are living communities navigating the pressures and contradictions of the contemporary world. Poverty, political marginalization, land rights struggles, the tension between traditional practices and modern economic demands. In Guatemala, the Maya genocide of the 1970s and 1980s, in which military governments killed somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people, the majority of them indigenous Maya, in a counterinsurgency campaign against rural communities. represents a trauma of enormous depth that still shapes the politics and psychology of Guatemalan Maya communities today. The ancient ruins that draw tourists to Tikal and Chichén Itzá generate economic activity that sometimes benefits local Maya communities and sometimes flows past them to larger outside interests. The relationship between heritage tourism, cultural sovereignty, and the economic well-being of living Maya people is genuinely contested and genuinely important. What is clear is that the Maya cultural inheritance is not simply an archaeological matter. It is a living one. The Popol Vuh, translated into Spanish by Friar Francisco Jiménez in the early 18th century from a Quiché alphabetic manuscript and now available in multiple modern translations, continues to be a text of living cultural importance to Quiché and other Guatemalan Mayan communities. The traditional calendar, particularly the 260-day Sokin, is still actively maintained by specialized ritual practitioners, the Ajkijab or daykeepers, who counsel community members on propitious dates for planting, building, ceremony, and other significant activities. The corn-based agricultural cycle that was already ancient when El Mirador rose from the Mirador Basin swamps continues in highland Maya communities, with traditional varieties of maize maintaining a genetic diversity that represents millennia of selective cultivation. Traditional textile weaving, with its intricate patterns that encode community identity, continues to be practiced, and the survival of specific weaving traditions has become a form of cultural resistance against the pressures toward cultural homogenization. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphics, which has progressed from being able to read almost nothing in the mid-20th century to being able to read well above 90% of surviving text today, has fundamentally transformed the field. What was once a civilization understood primarily through its buildings and its objects is now a civilization we can hear speaking, in its own words, across a gap of 1,000 years. The inscriptions on the stelae of Tikal tell us the names of kings and the dates of their victories. The painted texts on the ceramic vessels recovered from elite tombs record mythological narratives and the identities of the patrons who commissioned them. The hieroglyphs in the corbelled chambers of Palenque's palace compound describe the cosmological events that govern the city's sacred calendar. The Dresden Codex preserves astronomical tables that allow modern astronomers to verify the precision of ancient Maya skywatching. All of this is now accessible, not as mystery, not as alien transmission, but as human communication, the record of a people who wanted to be known and who encoded that desire into the enduring medium of stone and bark and painted clay. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Maya, after everything we have covered tonight, is that their civilization does not belong to the past tense. We use the past tense for convenience, because we are describing historical events and historical achievements. But a civilization whose descendants are still alive, still speaking languages that their ancient ancestors would have recognized as their own, still marking the same sacred calendar, still planting the same maize in the same soils where their grandparents and great-grandparents planted it across 2,000 years. That civilization has not ended. It has transformed. As all civilizations do all the time, whether or not they happen to leave behind stone pyramids as evidence of their earlier forms. The great cities will not be rebuilt. The divine kings will not return. The Classic period, with its astonishing concentration of intellectual and artistic achievement in those two magnificent centuries between 600 and 800 CE, is history, carved into limestone and buried under centuries of jungle growth. But the people are here. The languages are here. The calendar is here. And every new LiDAR survey, every newly deciphered inscription, every archaeological season that adds another chapter to the story, these are not acts of recovering something vanished. They are acts of reunion, of a civilization that never stopped existing finally being heard and understood by the wider world it had been trying to communicate with all along. The Maya built not merely cities but a cosmos in stone. In the dense jungles and high valleys of Mesoamerica, over 3,000 years of continuous cultural development, they created a civilization of extraordinary intellectual ambition and genuine achievement. They watched the sky and made sense of it. They turned the difficult tropics into productive agriculture through ingenuity and collective effort. They organized complex societies with elaborate governing systems, and they expressed their understanding of existence in hieroglyphs and pyramids and painted books and the rhythmic structure of interlocking calendars that tracked both the mortal span of individual lives and the vast astronomical cycles that dwarfed them. They suffered collapse and endured. They faced conquest and survived. And their descendants walk the same landscape today, speaking languages their ancestors would have recognized, marking the same sacred calendar, living within an inheritance that reaches back to the first farmers who broke ground in the Mirador Basin 4,000 years ago. The jungle has reclaimed much of what they built, but it has not erased it. And with every lidar survey that peels back another canopy of vegetation, with every inscription that is deciphered and translated, with every community of Maya people that maintains its language and its ceremony and its deep relationship to the land and the sky, the civilization speaks again. It was never truly silent. We simply needed to learn how to listen. The pyramids are still there, pointing at the sky. The stars that the Maya watched are still there, moving in the patterns that Maya astronomers cataloged with such patient precision. And the living people who are their descendants carry all of that forward, not as a museum exhibit but as a life, complicated, contested, ongoing, and profound. That is the truth of the Maya, and it is far more extraordinary than any ancient astronaut story could dream of being. If you have made it to the end of this journey through the Maya world, through the swamps of the Preclassic, the pyramids of the Classic, the mysteries of the collapse, and into the living present of millions of Maya people today, thank you for staying with me through all of it. This channel exists because of people who love history deeply enough to want to sit with it slowly and let it become real. There is something about the Maya story in particular, the sheer scale of what they achieved, the depth of what they understood, the sadness of what was lost and the persistence of what endured, that rewards exactly this kind of slow, careful attention. You cannot rush the Popol Vuh. You cannot skim the Dresden Codex. You cannot glance at Tikal's temple, one rising above the jungle canopy, and come away understanding what it means. These things require time. They require patience. They require the willingness to sit with complexity rather than reach for a simple explanation. If tonight's story moved you or made you curious or gave you something to take into your dreams, please consider leaving a like, dropping a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribing to the Drowsy Archivist so you don't miss what comes next. There is so much more history to explore together. Sleep well.